No one expected a quiet Southern senator to steal the spotlight in a room full of Ivy League voices. But when Elizabeth Warren threw a jab meant to humiliate, John Kennedy didn't flinch, he educated. What happened next left the entire Senate speechless, and the internet on fire. You could hear a pin drop in the Senate chamber, until Elizabeth Warren broke the silence. What began as a standard hearing on public education funding was about to erupt into a viral political moment. At first glance, the setting was nothing out of the ordinary. Lawmakers settled into their leather chairs, analysts flipped open notebooks, and cameras blinked expectantly from every corner. The topic? Education reform, a subject debated to exhaustion, yet always emotionally charged. But this wasn't just another policy discussion. It was a battlefield. And on that battlefield stood two unlikely combatants. On one side, Senator Elizabeth Warren, a polished Harvard professor turned progressive firebrand, celebrated for her no-nonsense tone and razor-sharp critiques. On the other, Senator John Kennedy of Louisiana, a soft-spoken Southerner with a disarming folksiness, frequently underestimated and often caricatured. From the outset, both senators held their ground during the hearing. Charts were presented, statistics debated, and predictable sound bites echoed through the chamber. But then something shifted. The conversation veered off course subtly at first, then unmistakably personal. It happened when Senator Warren, with a half-smirk and a raised brow, aimed her remarks directly at Senator Kennedy. Her words were calculated, her tone dismissive. It's hard to take education advice from someone who probably got their diploma out of a cereal box. For a split second, time seemed to freeze. Senators exchanged uncertain glances. A few aides chuckled nervously. But the laughter didn't last. It evaporated, leaving only a cold, stunned silence in its place. Because everyone in that chamber knew, this wasn't just a policy jab. This was personal. This was a public attempt to ridicule a man's background, intellect, and voice. A man who had never conformed to the elite mold. All eyes turned to Kennedy. He didn't flinch. He didn't smirk. He didn't even blink. He simply sat motionless, his expression unreadable. There was no trace of anger, just an eerie calm, the kind that unsettles a room. Because those who know Senator John Kennedy know this. He's not just another awshucks Southern politician. Beneath the folksy cadence lies an Oxford education. Behind the unpolished charm, a fierce intellect. Kennedy has built a career on being underestimated, and turning that into his greatest weapon. In that moment, the insult didn't just land on Kennedy's shoulders. It reverberated far beyond the Senate floor. It reached every small-town teacher who'd been dismissed as underqualified. Every student mocked for their accent. Every working-class American made to feel lesser because they didn't speak with a polished East Coast drawl. The stage was set. The cameras were rolling. And the entire country was watching. Would Kennedy fire back? Would he rise to the bait? Or would he, true to form, do what no one expected? What followed would leave even his harshest critics speechless and spark a national conversation about dignity, class, and what it truly means to be educated. Senator Kennedy waited. Not a moment too soon, not a second too late. With quiet control, he leaned forward, adjusted his microphone, and spoke with the calm precision of a man who has been insulted before and conquered far worse. "Ma'am," he began, his southern drawl as steady as bedrock. "I may sound like I'm from the country because I am. I'm proud of it. But I didn't get my education from a cereal box. I got it from Oxford." A hushed wave moved across the room. Suddenly, the Ivy League air felt a bit thinner. He wasn't done. "I didn't visit Oxford. I studied there. Under Sir Rupert Cross. One of the finest legal scholars in the world," Kennedy continued, eyes locked onto Warren's. "My degrees weren't handed to me on a silver platter. I earned them, with sweat, sacrifice, and the same drive I see in the students of every underfunded public school in my state. No shouting. No theatrics. Just precision." In an instant, Kennedy flipped the entire narrative. The supposed country bumpkin had just dropped a legal resume that could rival anyone in the room. But it wasn't just about credentials. It was about the values behind them. "The issue isn't how someone speaks or what their accent sounds like," he said, scanning the room. "The issue is how we treat people who don't sound like us. Whether we believe their ideas are worth listening to, even if they don't wear the right suit or have the right vocabulary." What Warren had miscalculated wasn't just Kennedy's education. It was his ability to channel that moment into something bigger, a lesson. He wasn't defending himself alone. He was defending everyone who had ever been laughed at, dismissed, or ignored because of where they came from. "I've read more Supreme Court decisions than I can count," Kennedy added. "But you know what sticks with me? The letters I get from parents who can't afford after-school tutors. From teachers buying supplies out of their own pockets. From kids working 2 jobs just to stay in college. That's the education debate we should be having." As he spoke, the mood in the chamber shifted. Staffers put down their pens. Reporters stopped typing. Even Warren's closest allies looked away, some adjusting their posture, others frozen in place. Kennedy had made it personal, but not petty. Emotional, but not emotionalized. He pulled back the curtain on a truth too many ignore. That dignity is not a byproduct of a diploma, and respect is not earned through pronunciation. "Smart," Kennedy said slowly, "doesn't always sound fancy." That line hit like a thunderclap. Not because it was catchy, but because it was true. The hearing was no longer just about public education. It was about public perception, of intelligence, of background, of who gets to speak and be heard. Warren's attack had been sharp, but Kennedy's reply was surgical. He had taken a cheap shot and turned it into a masterclass. In restraint, in clarity, in unapologetic authenticity. By the time he finished, the tension had transformed. The room wasn't angry. It wasn't stunned. It was reverent. Some might say he delivered a clapback. But it wasn't that. It was a rebuttal born from principle, not pride. It was the voice of someone who had been told to sit down more times than he could count, and chose, every time, to stand up instead. And outside the chamber, people were listening. As the gavel struck, marking the official end of the session, the echoes of Senator Kennedy's words lingered like smoke in the chamber. It was clear to everyone present, and to the millions who would later watch the exchange online, that something deeper had just unfolded. Not just a rebuttal, not just a viral moment, a shift. What Kennedy had done was more than defend his own reputation. He had redefined the moment. Where many would have struck back with fury, he answered with foundation. Where most would have taken offense, he built connection. And in doing so, he had altered the tone of the entire conversation. Not just in the Senate, but in the hearts of Americans who watched, listened, and recognized themselves in his words. By the time clips of the moment flooded the internet, the hashtags told the story. Hashtag Kennedy class, hashtag Oxford drawl, hashtag smart sounds different, hashtag Senate silence. But it wasn't just the internet that felt the impact. Teachers, students, parents from all over the country began sharing their own stories, about being overlooked, about being underestimated, about being judged for how they speak rather than what they say. Kennedy had opened the floodgates for a conversation long overdue. Pundits called it one of the most effective Senate responses of the decade. Some praised its tone. Others marveled at its composure. But almost everyone agreed it was real. It was grounded. And it cut through the noise. Senator Warren, for her part, made no further comments that day. Perhaps she realized that the real loss wasn't just rhetorical, it was relational. In a moment where she might have built a coalition, she chose division. And Kennedy, without raising his voice, turned that division into unity. Not by pandering, but by speaking to a shared truth. That how someone sounds doesn't define how smart they are. In the days that followed, Kennedy's speech was replayed in classrooms and town halls. It was quoted in op-eds and newsletters. More importantly, it resonated with the kind of people rarely spoken for in Capitol Hill debates. People who feel invisible, unheard, or misunderstood. And that is where Kennedy truly triumphed. Not in scoring points against a political rival. Not in crafting the perfect comeback. But in doing what the best leaders do, he turned an insult into an invitation. An invitation to re-examine our assumptions. To value authenticity over artifice. And to remember that wisdom, compassion, and credibility don't always come wrapped in elite packaging. As the chamber emptied, Kennedy remained seated for a moment longer. Perhaps reflecting. Perhaps letting the silence say what needed to be said. His microphone was off, but the message was loud. True intelligence isn't measured in words per minute. It's measured in character per choice. And on that day, character spoke loudest of all. In a political landscape often fueled by noise, John Kennedy reminded America of something far more powerful. Restraint, dignity, and truth spoken plainly. He didn't just defend himself, he defended the millions who've been talked down to, overlooked, or mocked for not sounding elite. His words weren't a comeback, they were a correction, a quiet but seismic shift in the conversation. And as the cameras faded and the headlines rolled in, one thing was clear: authenticity still matters. Sometimes, the strongest voice in the room is the one that doesn't have to shout.